but also China are now consuming a lot. And the point of all that is just to say that production and consumption are wildly decoupled now. And to enable this, you need large multinational traders. And these are exactly the companies that I focus on. Now, taking a step back, what has been the impact of this on forests? Well, in the last 2 decades alone, we've lost 75 million hectares of forest. These are just areas in purple where you've had tree cover loss overlaid with the tropical primary forest areas that were recognized in those regions. And this is more than 75 million hectares, more than 3 times the size of the UK. Of course, because the tropics are massive, and even when you deforest 18% of the Amazon, that's bigger than most European countries. And this accounts for 18% of gross global CO2 emissions, more emissions than the entire EU. So it's a really big part of the climate problem. And of course, it's a huge threat to biodiversity. So just to recap, we've had this increase in demand and production locations decoupled from consumption locations. We get, as a result of this, the consolidation and expansion of agri-food businesses. So 4 to 5 major companies in each food area control a majority of all the food that's traded across the world. Domestic markets are a different beast, but when we're talking about trade, it's just a handful of companies enabling all of these things. And farmers are increasingly limited in what their options are, especially as they're incentivized with migration and colonization, internal colonization programs to go out into these tropical frontiers. There's not much they can actually do. In some places, all you can do is cattle. So as a result of this, you get, just basically no other option, given all of the incentives, capacities, and constraints, but for farmers to do deforestation and to do it in a way that's not even getting them much benefit, and certainly not developing the regional economies, because they're quite low income activities. They just have a lot of scale. So this is where supply chain policies come in, because there's this kind of pinch point in the middle with food traders. And specifically, this is relevant for Latin America and Asia. There's smaller exports coming out of less of the deforestation in Africa goes for export driven. But in Latin America and Asia, it's 30 to 40% of all the deforestation is driven by external markets. And basically, civil society actors like Greenpeace have done a lot of name and shame campaigns, and increasingly financial institutions have been pressuring these organizations, these traders, and sometimes also manufacturers and retailers. Many UK retailers have zero deforestation commitments. But anyway, they say they're not going to buy any products that were grown on lands cleared after a certain year. These are called zero deforestation commitments. And the theory of change is that if these traders have a policy saying you can't do it, then all of these farmers are going to adjust their practices. Very simple logic. You won't have a market to sell to. The problem you can see already is that those traders are only covering about 30 to 40% of the market, of the whole market. So we wanted to study this. We were studying this beforehand, but with our initial knowledge, as these things started getting rolled out in the initial early 2000s, and actually 2010s is when they started coming into focus. And then in 2019, I put together a bunch of grant proposals, and especially my ERC starting grant was really trying to get at this in a systematic way, where we look at Brazil in the Amazon, the Cerrado, Indonesia, and Borneo, and Sumatra, and also the upper Ghanaian forest regions of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And we look across commodities, and we do both our field work, where we do supply chain interviews and household interviews. So we're combining observational descriptive analysis with also causal analysis. We have 2 randomized controlled trials still going on in Sumatra and Cote d'Ivoire. And we do large-scale regional modeling. So we're trying to get at the mechanisms and understanding contextual factors, and also do comparative analysis. We focus on these three regions because Brazil is the largest deforestation in the world, and Indonesia is always top three. And in terms of change, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are ones experiencing an acceleration versus what they historically had. And the complication of all of this, why it's interesting scientifically, why people are not just doing this all the time in terms of studying it, is because it's really complicated. So historically, people used to look at certified and not certified farms and see what was the additionality of getting certified. But now these certified farms and non-certified farms are connected to traders, some of whom have policies. This is an acronym that I use for forest-focused supply chain policies instead of zero deforestation commitments, because some of these policies are not zero deforestation. Some of them are about agroforestry or zero illegal. But anyway, they're also connected to other downstream companies that have different commitments as well. But the point is that if one of these companies has a commitment, they're supposed to be able to do this kind of police patrol monitoring where, you know, they have the farm polygon and they're able to look at the boundaries and see if there's deforestation happening on the farm and not purchase it. Hopefully everybody could follow that background. And so then what we had to do to figure out where these spatial footprints are, essentially get information on what kind of policies the companies have, the different quality of them, the different cutoff dates, and then try to understand their sourcing regions. And we start to map it all out. As far as the quality, we can start to say something about whether or not they actually have good policies in terms of environmental effectiveness potential, but also equity, smallholder inclusion. And we can see, all right, which areas are covered, have a good spatial fit, they're high quality commitments covering forests at risk, and a functional fit covering smallholders with smallholder appropriate policies. And so one of the things we did more at the micro scale is go and interview people everywhere. So we have done thousands of interviews across these regions with my exceptionally talented team, many of whom came with me from Switzerland to Cambridge and are finishing their PhDs now. I'm not going to cover other methods here, but we also do at Delphi expert elicitation, the RCTs that I mentioned, and focus groups. So if there's students in the room trying to understand how to do all these different things, feel free to talk to us. We've pretty much done it all when it comes to methods. We actually teach class at Cambridge on mixed method policy analysis. So yeah, what did we find? A whole lot of work just to be able to say that cattle commitments cover about 50% of production. And also, so that's just in the Amazon. We didn't have data on the Cerrado, but it's also similarly high coverage for soy in the Amazon Cerrado. That's good. So in Brazil, you have pretty good coverage. In cocoa, it varies a lot by state, but it gets up to 44% of production. To this day, ourselves and our collaborators at TRACE, which is part of the Stockholm Environment Institute, Transparency for Sustainable Economies initiative, like they still can't get the data on Ghana. So this is an ongoing challenge. We try to model things when we can't get the data, but sometimes it's impossible to model it as well because the supply chains are so informal and the infrastructure is not there to try to estimate supply sheds. And then in Indonesia, you're getting down to certain places like Papua New Guinea, come on in, that's okay, that only have 19% of the market covered. So already you see, if you don't have high coverage, it's very easy for a farmer that wants to deforest to just avoid. The other challenge is these supply chains are incredibly complicated. This is just one example of painstaking multi-year work to try to map out supply chains in Indonesia. And, you know, you've got some independent smallholders, some tied producers. And not only do we not know if you're a company going in this direction, but as researchers, even if we start with the farmers, we can't even trace back all of the mills and buyers that production is going to. So there's a lot of lack of transparency. this idea that there's going to be 100% traceability, like with the EU deforestation regulation that was just passed, right now is not possible. A lot of companies are saying they're doing it, but they're no one's there yet, and they're working towards it. But there are some things that they have to change to even be able to do that. Like they'd have to drop tons of informal suppliers because there's too many intermediaries. There's one finding that across all these supply chains, 40% of all the production goes through an indirect supplier. That means that the U.S. company are sourcing from a direct supplier, but they're getting their product from somebody else. All right. So on the equity side, we found, for example, that only 46% of all oil palm plots of smallholders are even in a region where companies have some kind of program to support smallholders. Same case in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So they're not going to be effective if they're not reaching these indirects or these smallholders. The other issue is just like basic social systems and ecological system dimensions like ecosystem services, social networks. These policies don't take any of this science into account. They're targeting individual suppliers, okay? Individual suppliers, and leaving out all of these other indirect suppliers, as I said. But then, like in many regions, the forest isn't even on their farm. The forest is in this other area. So what is the actual ecological benefit of one tree on this farm? It has no impact. You have to have some kind of scale, some viable habitat size, some corridors, and protecting the remaining forest reserves. So a lot of policies are like, especially in West Africa, are targeting these individual farms with tree planting or deforestation, but then they're ignoring the whole remaining forest reserve in that community. Are you depressed? The thing is that it's not all bad, and I'll start with the best case scenario, and then I'll move to the worst case. In soybeans, where you have large scale commodity producers with big multi-million-dollar tractors and very square grids, and everybody is regularized and formal, these policies are really good. They actually reduce deforestation by 55%. The not so good thing, soy is a highly traded commodity. And so we estimated with a global equilibrium modeling framework that 50% of this was offset by leakage. So, the avoided deforestation in the Amazon went to other biomes. Well, still, that's pretty good.
Sorry, but by that you mean so the soy that isn't produced in Brazil is produced somewhere else?
This actually, it all ended up being majority of it ended up being displaced within Brazil. So this policy only focused on the Amazon, and we found that in our, and this is a modeling framework, so we have to run the counterfactual of if the policy had never occurred, and compare that to the policy. And so to measure the additionality. So it's all modeled, but what we found that is in the modeled scenario, what happened is more of the soy production ended up, the history that we saw is more soy production ended up occurring in places like the Brazilian Cerrado and the Atlantic forest and other places, the Pampas, the South, than would have occurred if the policy had been there. More production would have just been in the Amazon. So the cattle ranching one, because it has these longer, more informal producers and more complicated supply chains, they only reduced deforestation by 15%. And then we found really in oil palm, we have like quadruple check this and have been, challenged by every possible reviewer. No additionality in these policies. So they have not reduced deforestation beyond. And so what you see is actually everyone reduced deforestation in oil palm during this period. And it has to do with the background economic and political changes that occurred. So this is why it's so important to do counterfactual analysis. I'm really find this one kind of exciting, though I really expected to see no impacts of these policies that they're doing in Cote d'Ivoire, but we measured but they're actually trying something different. which is promising. They're doing a payment for environmental services, which isn't always good in every context, but in this one it makes sense. Small, poor farmers. And they're paying them to plant trees on their farm, agroforestry, like shade trees. And I thought the way that they were distributing them, I didn't really expect it to see ongoing adoption, because they just drop the trees off, and they don't spend a lot of time on dissemination and norms building and things like that. But we found an increase in 1.7 trees per hectare on the farms as a result of these payment for environmental services programs by cocoa companies. And the good news is they didn't do this at the expense of native trees on their property. They didn't reduce the native trees or remove any of their existing trees. So, maybe they're having a small additional impact on shade cover, which would mostly bring, it's actually not even clear what the benefits of that would be for biodiversity yet. Possibly some small impacts for pollinators, but from a climate and carbon perspective, it's probably good for the companies to count all that carbon. And maybe from a climate resilience standpoint, it's actually quite helpful because of the microclimate is a little bit cooler. So, then we were studying a really cool natural experiment. You had one of the most progressive Brazilian presidents in power for quite some time, Lula, and then all of the sudden, what happened in Brazil, what's happening in my country right now is a different president comes along and hates the environment. And so, Bolsonaro came along in 2019. And we had these policies in place since 2009, and we have all of these, long land use history. And fortunately, I've been doing research in this area for over a decade now, over 15 years now. So we were able to look over time at what happened, and we found that the talk had reduced deforestation significantly. I didn't put I thought I had put up the percentages, but maybe, oh yeah, good. So the talk, which is titled Forest Focused Supply Chain Policy, it reduced deforestation by 0.57% annually. So it's a small amount, but it was something. Okay. And then when Bolsonaro came along, its additionality reduced by 89%. As he was essentially telling people to deforest, saying that he was going to roll back all the existing public environmental regulation. In general, the media and all the narratives around them say there's a general sense of impunity. We don't measure the mechanism, but that's our hypothesis about the underlying mechanism, is that all of a sudden farmers felt like it was less important to comply with the private sector policies. Okay, so this is an indication that for these policies to succeed, they should be in a supportive, even though they're useful as a stopgap for when they're supposed to be they're thought to be useful as a stopgap for when there's a lack of political will in these countries to reduce deforestation, but actually they seem to work better when there is good high political will, and when there's low political will, they don't work at all. So anyway, more to unpack with all of that in the future. These are all super recent things. And another thing that we see happening, and I verified this with a lot of other people on the ground, and we're seeing this also with restoration efforts too. But basically, efforts to reduce deforestation for cocoa, we find they're being effective on the cocoa farms. But then what's happening is we're finding food production increasing in the forest reserves. So essentially, you're reducing deforestation for cocoa, but as more of the land becomes saturated outside of the forest reserve for cocoa, you're getting more deforestation for food for subsistence crops inside the forest areas. So, if the story wasn't bad enough, it gets worse if you're a smallholder. So if you're a smallholder, all of this looks just like essentially what our interviews reveal is that all of this looks just like companies, coming at you again, making up whatever rules they can to sort of, take advantage of you. That is basically the perspective of many of the farmers in these supply chains. And they literally use the word care So, care ethics is like a new hot academic topic, but when you interview farmers, they're like, I just wish these companies actually cared, that they actually talk to us, recognize their historical interaction with us, and cared what happens to us. But all they see of these companies is them coming in and telling them what to do or what not to do. And they distrust generally like any type of land registration process because they feel like they're just going to try to take their land. Another issue, this one is quite solvable. It's like most farmers don't even know these policies exist. So even in the mill sheds that we found like had really good quality policies, only 7% of the farmers had even heard of them. So the farmers are all exposed to them. Only 7% of them even know that they exist. Whereas, and just to sort of, for some perspective, is like at least 39% of them know that there's certification programs. There's more of them that understand the national laws. Very few of them know what's going on with these private sector companies. We found that companies admit that they prioritize cost effectiveness over inclusion, so they'd rather just exclude some smallholders and because it's lower costs and try to include them and get them compliant. All of that's going to reduce the additionality. And they devolve in the cattle sector. We've seen that the slaughterhouses have just decided to implement new blockchain systems. Essentially, that put the burden on the direct suppliers. So they go to the cattle fatteners and they say, you have to record all of your indirect suppliers. You can decide who to buy from and who not to. You will record it all in the blockchain. That's getting rolled out now. But historically, that's even before the blockchain, that was the approach. And they weren't monitoring the indirects. And then they said, but we're only going to deal with you, the direct suppliers. So what happened? Does anybody have any guesses? The direct suppliers all decided to drop the smallholder cattle calves, or the calf producers that they were buying from, because this is how it works. Small farmers specialize in making calves, and then they sell it to the larger farmers who fatten them. So then the larger farmer says, this is too much trouble, too much risk. Let's just start making calves on our farm. So we saw this complete vertical integration of the cattle system, whereby the cattle ranchers are just doing the full cycle production. Now that actually has some benefits. Actually, they're doing better. They're more efficient. There's like some intensification happening. So if you cared only about the climatic element of like per unit of meat production, that there's some benefits there. What's the problem is that none of those smallholders, there's no leverage to improve their behavior anymore. They're just like off doing their thing, selling to local butchers, and they're not going to stop deforesting if they need to. What's going on here? Yeah, and then in cocoa, we found that they're still buying from smallholder farmers producing in forest reserves. They're just using it as an excuse not to pay them the premium anymore. So anyway, just to recap, they have some measurable impacts. They're not huge. They're not going to end deforestation. There's insufficient scope coverage of different actors, and not great implementation, and the surrounding policy markets, supply chain, and land use context all need to align for these things to be successful. We're working on trying to create this alignment, but stay tuned because we're also testing some radically different approaches that involve working at the community scale. I'm skipping ahead to my policy recommendations. Maybe I'll pause, get back to it. Okay, so yeah, the political windows come and go. As I said, we need to pay more attention to this. We need to be better overall in conservation and food systems, like to be able to foresee when a political window will emerge, to be able to enact these more ambitious policies. And there are going to be some intractable trade-offs, like not everything's going to be a win-win, and we need to confront that, at least under the existing economies. So we're working on, one of the things I'm doing right now is sort of more from a policy innovation standpoint, more of an applied focus is like, I applied for a proof of concept grant to try to develop more of an equity management system for companies. Like, how could you actually operationalize this so they don't just say it's too complicated, I won't deal with it? See how that goes. But so we're not just saying do this, we're trying to actually help them develop it. They need to take a conservation mitigation and hierarchy approach, like focusing on tree planting on individual farms. That's way down the conservation hierarchy, and focusing on like restoring a small amount of tree cover while they're ignoring the forest that remains in forest reserve area. So they need to align with the conservation mitigation hierarchy. And they need to focus more at the scale and address underlying determinants of behavior better, and also try to catalyze things at a scale that will actually influence farmers. So what our randomized control trials are all trying to get at is, we've been conducting with the companies workshops and a bunch of gamification and other things where we're trying to get people to an inter-village competition where we're trying to get people to do things at the village scale and make public commitments to the rest of their community members about what they're going to do differently, and talk about why it matters to their community to help reduce, landslides, to create better microclimate, to enable better food provisioning from the forest and stuff like that. And then, with all of this, we say companies need to view inclusion as a core to effectiveness and efficiency. Otherwise, they're doing all of this stuff for no reason. So even if you don't care about smallholders at all, you need to, because you're not going to get your avoided deforestation. So doing well, actually, it seems. So then we come into taking a step back and looking at this through the lens of socio-technical transitions or innovation studies, and saying, right, we're trying to do all of this, and it's within a structure. And the structure includes a landscape. Let me see if I have labels here. Yeah. A landscape, which is like the broader exogenous environment, where we have this increasing consumption, the absence of markets for environmental services, and increasing demand for meat, oil, and contradictory sustainable development goals. We have regions built around colonial legacies and financial liberalization paradigms that basically designed the economies around extractive activities that just don't add any value. That's what I mean by extractive. Very like a low quality, environmentally destructive, and adds no value. And they have flawed development logics, like generating foreign exchange was the only sort of development logic. And then any sort of niche of more sustainable practices, sustainable intensification, agroforestry, non-timber forest production, like all of those things struggle. If they're green, they're struggling to scale because they're blocked by all of that. So from deforestation policies within individual supply chains, we need to go to more structural changes. We need to talk about culture and values on the consumption and production side. We need to talk about new legislative and economic models, adjusting the goals, and value redistribution. We need to be creating more value for the more marginalized people in these communities, because you can't just ignore them. So this requires having a new vision. So, you might be hearing more about sort of more normative approaches or participatory approaches, transdisciplinary approaches, co-design, all that stuff. All of those things are tools that you can use to try to understand what different visions could look like and what communities actually want. And essentially what happened was a bunch of the indigenous communities and traditional communities in Brazil and the Amazon got together and within sort of broader grassroots movements and proposed an alternative model. They proposed this idea of socio-bioeconomies. They proposed it as an alternative to the bioeconomy model, which is more technocratic, more efficiency focused, and wanted to focus it more on traditional and indigenous knowledge and justice, diversity, and resilience goals. And so, we've been doing some work within the UN Science Panel for the Amazon to try to understand what this could look like and how we could get there. This is just a definition of socio-bioeconomies. It's essentially economies based around supporting the well-being, knowledge, rights, and territories of Indigenous people, local communities, and also other people. So it can be anything that's essentially like conservation. And when I say conservation, I mean conservation of people as well. Conservation, protection, rights of Indigenous and traditional communities. Anything that's compatible with that. So it's not just about the land use, but how the land use is done. So, you can do native nut cultivation, harvesting, and processing. But if you just did like native nut cultivation and didn't add any value to that, that's not particularly helpful. If you did monocultures of a certain fruit, that wouldn't qualify. But if you're doing it within diversified agroforestry systems, that would qualify. Anyway, we had to kind of try to set out what's in and what's not in, because this term can be easily co-opted. But you might have heard of acai. You can get an acai bowl pretty much everywhere now in England. It's a superfruit. There's lots of latex, rubber, beija. Anybody here wearing beija shoes? The sole of your shoe is made out of Amazonian rubber. And enteroba, there's lots of like cosmetics, things like that. Super valuable. And this is like, there are no figures on this. So we want to get more figures out there. But just to say, they already generate 1.4 billion US dollars per year. They could generate up to 8.2 billion per year, and probably even more. But what's important is, even if you're not impressed by 8.2 billion, compared to what cattle generate every year, 1.8 billion. So the land use that occupies 80% of all of the cleared land in the Amazon, generating only 1.8 billion. So like this need for new economic models is crucial. And these already exist. Eduardo Brandizio, who's at Indiana, has been leading a group of work where they started to map this out. And the Brazilian government just spent like hundreds of millions on grants to study this. So it's an emerging research area. So to get there, we need to do interventions at every scale. So we need to harness and tilt the landscape. This is from a cool paper I really like, Kanger et al. Policy leverage points to enable transformative changes. So harness and tilt the landscape towards regime change, stabilize the regime, and finance infrastructure, marketing, social organization improvements to accelerate alternatives. Just to be a little bit more specific, what I mean by this is we might have a new policy window with the EUDR, regardless of its problems going forward with all these traceability issues. There is a new sort of political will and financial possibility at the international scale to address this more systemically. If countries realize that they're going to lose out as a result of these policies and need to adjust which value chains they're investing in. Otherwise, they're going to lose European markets. We need to advocate for changes in international goals. These individual SDG types of approaches just don't work, like for trying to address this systemically. Strengthen cross-scale institutions. Here, I mean, there's not enough pan-Amazonian country-level collaboration, but more specifically, there needs to be more institution building to develop marketing pathways and technology transfer between the Amazon and other global South countries, but also between Europe and the Amazon. I don't even mention the United States right now because, let's be honest, that's not going to happen. They just pulled all of their development funding. So, at the regime scale, we're talking about, oh, sorry, I'm at the niche scale. At the niche scale, we're talking about shifting finance. So there's a whole new field of biodiversity and climate finance. And that's very unclear what financial mechanisms really work for biodiversity. But one thing that is clear is that there's way more harmful subsidies out there in the world, propping up these conventional economies, and those can be withdrawn. We need to address infrastructure. Roads and rails is going to be unavoidable. Cooperatives are key to all successful cases, so building up cooperative organizations is essential. And developing marketing pathways. I mean, you don't need to frame things as stop eating meat. Like, that's not going to fly with anyone. I mean, it flies with those of us who are already on board, but it's not going to fly with a lot of other people. But what would be useful is saying, hey, here are some other healthier things that you could be eating. Lots of superfoods, great for your health. And those can have benefits for the forest and for rural communities and taste really delicious. I'm addicted to acai. So again, this gets to the point of the only real solution is transformation. On the consumption side, we need to transform demand. And on the production side, we need to transform economies. I hope through this talk, you can see these problems with new eyes. I was inspired. This is not just a myth I told myself. This is an actual fact, according to my mom, that in kindergarten, they read this book, The Great Kapok Tree, at the YMCA little kindergarten I was going to, and I became obsessed with this book. And it's all about the Amazon rainforest. And I always wanted to do work with the Amazon. But what's really great is this is a person who wants to cut down trees, and we have all these misunderstandings about them, and what motivates them. But anyway, the animal actually goes and talks to them and like shifts his norms and his worldviews, and he understands when he wakes up why it's important to protect the forests. So take whatever you want out of this little story. Go read the book to your children or yourself, and yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the talk. And oops, I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Rachel. That was brilliant. And I always like talks which give the take-home message at the beginning and the end. So much easier. Now, the clock up there is 5 minutes past, so we have 15 minutes for questions. Who'd like to go first?
Your time. Oh, hey.
Hi.
Yeah, we've met before.
Was that a question?
No, I've got one, but it's still baking.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
A question. So, I mean, I find your argument really attractive in this way. So, but let me try and be devil's advocate,
Sure.
sort of coming from a more traditional economic perspective. Yeah. And we had a talk by Carlos Lopez, who used to lead for the African Union on trade negotiations with the EU on this. He was very, very negative about EUDR and what it will do in sub-Saharan Africa. And well, I shouldn't say this is what he thinks, but one of the arguments people put is, yes, the way we have tried to stimulate economic growth in general income countries have been pretty unsuccessful. And what you're presenting is a very organization. But perhaps the problem is we just haven't done it right. Carlos was arguing about that much of the way we have put money into low-income countries has been, and you made this point as well, to maintain the status quo so that they're still largely extraction economies, rather than building up the industry and the value addedness within country that will then increase the wealth of the population. The land will then give them the many of the economic benefits that we have enjoyed in
Yeah, I disagree.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, 100% agree. I'm also not in favor of the EUDR per se. Actually, I was a very initial critic.
Actually, just in case people don't know, do you want to just say?
Sure. So the EU deforestation regulation was a policy, actually on the committee of a student who studied the politics of all of this. Fascinating how that ended up developing. But basically, it developed in a very narrow way, where it was originally supposed to be part of a smart mix. That actually sounded quite good. That would couple this very stick-like approach, which says they just won't, you can't sell products on the EU market if they were grown on deforested land. And if you're sourcing products from areas deemed high risk, you need to establish new monitoring systems and like different systems for different risk countries. And then the ways that countries get marked as risk or not risk is very political as well. But it does nothing to address any of the equity challenges. It does nothing to challenge the extractive status quo. Totally agree. But the original conversations in which those were embedded about the smart mix, this is probably more of the window, the policy window that I was referring to, is there was a lot of alignment that there needed to be coupling much more development aid and much more collaboration to help countries, transition out of deforestation for production. And so that was quite good. But then there was a bunch of lobbying along the way that made it end up the way it is. But it's kind of still being challenged. And pretty much we're all saying that the equity dimensions are very problematic because there's already been like coffee farmers that have been dropped, and things like that. So yeah, I guess I just agree with you. And Carlos, I guess.
No, I'm very happy to have a private conversation with Rachel, but please encourage questions.
First of all, thank you so much. Super interesting. I tried to follow along even though I came in late, and apologies for that. I really appreciated your point on sort of what are strategies that we can do to address the niche segment. And when you spoke about sort of incubating social orgs, co-ops, things like that, I've been looking at the sort of food and agri space mainly in sort of Eastern and Southern Africa. And a lot of the conversation that we're having right now is, I mean, one, it's relatively commercial because there's an economic development incentive that's very strong. But also things like co-ops tend to be very, very hard to get to, even with, I mean, compared to your first point around, like, how do you get to even incentives around people who might invest in biodiversity, right? And so in a long way, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the only people that are willing to invest in this are not people that are willing to go into these kind of like more equitable structures. What have you seen around sort of like the different agents that might and the power imbalances in actually getting to those niche positions? Because I find that the struggle for power in those dimensions has been quite contentious.
It's a really good question. And there's a lot of active research on this on lots of different angles. And we're doing work trying to understand what causes some of these to succeed, why they don't succeed. And some people are looking at it from a social network perspective, but we're looking at it from more of a policy and finance perspective. And essentially what I can say initially, my initial observations were more that you need this alignment, this policy mix alignment, where you get the state government getting money from, trying to make too many points about policy, covering everything right now, but basically like you get the international development banks or other financial actors partner with the state. So then the state has a lot of power. And then they're working in places that have some niches already that work, and also did have some political power. So in Western Amazon, in Acre, the rubber tapper movement was quite strong. And there's some recognition of those political segments within the state. And so you get in Acre, for example, the alignment between finance, the national level policy, and all of that coming together to help create the micro level institutions that were needed to organize people. Because you need to organize them in scales they've not been organized in, and like that's very difficult, but also can be very fruitful for many reasons. And then you need to invest as well in the infrastructure, the big processing facilities, and you need to do the marketing, lobbying, like to the importing regions to make sure that they're buying those products. So you have to do it all at the same time. So my point is that it's a big push. You can't just do one of those things. You might as well do it one day at a time or something like that. And, that's my view.
Other questions online there?
Yep. So we've had one from Brian. He asks, has your team studied the interplay of private sector ZDCs with government policies? You mentioned that change in political regime can have a big impact on ZDC effectiveness, but have you observed whether private sector ZDCs tend to improve government policy related to deforestation and land use? Do they have a negative effect or none at all?
So I wouldn't say that we've studied it in that direction. The funny thing is, we kept getting ourselves confused with the Bolsonaro study. Actually, we were like, did the policy help to offset Bolsonaro's effects, or did Bolsonaro reduce the effect of or change the effect of the private sector policy? And then we settled on the fact that, like, with our causal identification strategy, we're probably studying the effect of the policy on the private sector. And from a logic perspective, it's hard to imagine that the private sector policy influenced the national policy implementation. On the other hand, I think there's a bigger political economy study that needs to be done about how the lobbying of these companies affects the policy making. But right now, it does seem to be more of the other direction. A lot of traders backed off their platform when Bolsonaro came in because the agribusiness lobby was so powerful. But yeah, I would say that's a big knowledge gap that Dryan can solve. Sorry, I couldn't catch that name exactly. Yeah.
I loved your presentation. You did a great job of showing how these policies have failed on so many dimensions. And
Greg, by the way.
I'm Greg.
Yeah. Okay.
And I might even go, a little further and say they didn't just they weren't just insufficient. They may have been wrong in their basic premise to some degree. And I think, given your call for transformation, we're probably not too far from that. The one, and I loved how you then talked about the socio-bioeconomy and kind of proposals for indigenous and traditional led knowledge intensive, the kind of forest compatible economies. I think the one side that I'd like to kind of pull on a little bit more is the demand side, and it's something that you mentioned. But I think I might argue there's a problem with viewing export-oriented production as a pathway or as a key pathway to some of these transformations. On the one hand, because I think we have to say, you laid out the kind of huge increase in global agricultural trade. It's crazy to suggest that there's a sustainable way for the EU or the US to get such a huge proportion of its consumption from other parts of the world.
I mean, I don't know how much more you have to say, but I would just have to say I totally agree. And I completely forgot to say the part of the socio-bioeconomy that was focused more on circularity and regional like short chain opportunities. But yeah.
So the only other thing I would say is the export-oriented problem also applies to these socio-bioeconomic products like acai, right? Because it's great to have a high-value forest product that can be where there's demand and people can earn an income from it and people can consume it healthily abroad and so forth. But we see a commodity boom for acai, right? That has local effects in terms of kind of the quinoa effect of acai not being affordable to local people because of all this international demand. The sort of acaiization of estuary forests as this boom crop, leads to ecological change. So that's a function of what happens when you rely on kind of export-oriented commodities, right? As opposed to what you said, kind of more regional level.
I took out all my slides on like all the risks and sorry, that was safeguards needed. Oops. Anyway, but yeah, just to say, there was a bunch of stuff I didn't get into, which I just totally agree with you. I don't think that there is a single solution, and I think this one has a lot of risks as well. But I somehow feel it's necessary to shift the narrative, of what is it, 50 years of cattle ranching, for example, in the Amazon. Like, It's so bad. Cattle ranch is just so bad for every aspect of the environment and people. That I guess my own personal normative take is like, even if there's risks of like acaiization, you know, I feel like those are more manageable than the risks of like ongoing cattle ranching and the thresholds that we're crossing. And especially just also, you know, there's also stuff about violence and cattle culture and machismo and like, you know, we do interviews with women in this in Acre as well. We haven't published yet, like the domestic violence. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming you probably also agree, like, but how we thread that needle is.
I was just thinking back to the conversation we had in Mexico about
Nice name drop, isn't it?
at the
Global Land Program Open Science Meeting.
Yes.
You guys should all
Just
come
on the
to
beach
that.
somewhere we
So
were-
great.
Oh, well.
yeah, but we had a really interesting conversation about chain of custody models and certifications. And I'm coming at this from my years in the greenhouse gas protocol, managing the technical working group, where it felt like the only lever that companies had to pull to reduce deforestation in their supply chain was certifications. And you had that one slide showing like the flow from the producers to the traders to the companies. So I'm just curious, this is like a really vague question, but I'm just curious like how certifications can or cannot fit into.
Well, you know, certifications were like about to die off, but you know, in some ways, right? As the supply chain approaches were to take off, like there was a lot less interest in certifications. Now all of a sudden, Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance have repositioned themselves as the way to comply with the EUDR. So the certifications are basically going to have a resurgence now as the credible third-party sort of verifier of all of these environmental impacts. So I actually think that you're going to see a lot more certification happening. But these certifying bodies need to solve some pretty big problems about their on-the-ground abilities to monitor anything, because they're, you know, we were working with this certification. We still are working with them, but they don't even know where the no. So so farmers are getting certified and certifying bodies don't actually even know where they are. So so yeah, let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
Question mark.
So that's I think a really important. Do you have time just to answer questions if people want to come up?
Yeah, I already told a bunch of people who messaged me before that I'm here to talk afterwards.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we'll stop the formal part of the talk now. But Rachel, that was a really super talk, and a sort of fascinating vision and thoughtfulness in there. And best of luck with this extraordinarily interesting research program. Please thank me.
Thank you for having me and inviting me. And you have to come to Cambridge.